A mysterious 6-foot-tall shadow. I lived in an old farmhouse that was over 150 years old in the 1990s and at some point had been used as a headquarters for Union troops in northern VA. Lots of creepy things happened there, but this is the shortest story I've got. The house had a stone cellar, divided into 2 rooms, and it always made me uncomfortable going down there to get anything for my parents. One day I was asked to find some menial object that was in the cellar, and I knew it would be in the room with the boiler in it, the room that also had a dysfunctional light. So I made my way into the basement, and lo and behold, the damn light wouldn't turn on, but the object I needed was within the frame of light reaching into the blackness of the room through the doorway. So I walked a few steps into the room, grabbed the object and randomly glanced around. In the corner of the room was a dark shadow about 6 feet in height, and humanoid in shape. No worries though, my dad kept his 6-foot-tall John Wayne cutout in the basement, so that had to be it. I calmly turned to my left and nearly jumped out of my damn skin as I came face to face with John Wayne just inside the doorway and leaning against the wall. I spun on my heels and stared into an empty corner where the dark shadow had been only moments before, and sprinted out of that cellar. I refused to go down into the basement for at least a month after that happened. Creepy things in the old house. My significant other grew up in a house built in the 1800s. All his life he had a hinky feeling about the coal cellar, a tiny little room off of the furnace room. When it came time to sell, our contractor/friend asked if we wanted the slates pulled up in that room and a new cement floor poured. We said sure, and they pulled up the slates only to find a much newer concrete slab had been poured underneath. My significant other completely backed out, and had the slabs put back down. Some things are better left undisturbed. I guess everyone who spent time in that house saw or heard things. It was mostly completely benign, like every time I passed by his parents' room. I saw out of the corner of my eye 2 or 3 people in older dress standing around in that room. Then I heard another friend who had house sat for us say the same thing. I even took down the drapes and rearranged the room, thinking it was trick of light and shadow. Nothing helped. Same friend staying alone there said he was awakened by people shouting at him. I'm glad that never happened to me. Probably the weirdest thing when my significant other was getting ready to sell the house, remodeling the kitchen, selling off the antiques, etc. He was standing near the fireplace with an antiques dealer, near stranger, and there was a largish, 4-foot, carved wooden horse mounted above it. It had been there for 40 to 50 years. Suddenly, the horse jumps about 3 feet from the wall to land at their feet. It wasn't like the nail finally loosened and the horse fell down, it jumped away from the wall. Freaky. Probably the most disturbing was when my father-in-law was pushed down the stairs. The basement was creepy enough, a warren of rooms ranging from the furnace room, the coal cellar, what must have been the wine cellar, etc. But that's where my father-in-law had his workshop set up. The stairs were steep and a bit treacherous. My significant other and I were living elsewhere, as was my father-in-law, but he still used the workshop on occasion. As he claims, one night he was going down the stairs and felt a hand on his back push him down the stairs. He broke his leg, which took over 6 months to heal. I might discount this if this was someone inclined to woo, but my father-in-law was an atheist and a scientist. The Haunted Warehouse. True story. Honor system. I work in a warehouse that my father purchased. He bought it for 25% of its cost from a farmer who seemed very excited to be rid of it. It is in the middle of Mennonite country, with no neighbors for a half-mile around. Look out the window, and you see cornfields and scraggly trees. Cell service. Forget about it. I work here alone, painting and preparing the front office portion for eventual functionality. To get to the front office, you must go through a hallway from the main warehouse, into a secondary office, and then through another door into the front. I frequently hear bumps and thuds and occasionally will go into the warehouse and feel air movement. But I've always attributed it to drafts and animal life in the roof. The only thing that has ever made me uneasy about the building is the fact that all of the door locks are reversed. Whoever installed those locks didn't intend to keep people out, they intended to keep something in. I was in the front office when I began to hear the thudding. I ignored it and continued to apply masking tape to the door I was working on. But this time, it was accompanied by a screeching sound. Not loud, but audible. I was freaked out, but convinced myself that it was just a pissed-off raccoon or squirrel that had found its way inside. I continued working until I heard the slam. The door to the secondary office had been open. It sounded like it had violently slammed shut. I peeked around the corner and saw that I was right. The secondary door was now closed. I tried to logic it through in my head that a strong draft had sucked it closed. Although I knew there was no such draft, the thudding began again. Closer this time. I've never been able to put a proximity on it, but now it sounded like it was right on the other side of the door. I froze, unsure of what was happening. My eyes locked on the door handle, which began to turn. The door disengaged its latch and slowly swung open. Wider and wider. Nothing there. Nothing visible, no air movement, just quiet. So quiet. A quiet that seemed to overwhelm me with its presence. A quiet so thick I couldn't breathe. The quiet was shattered when the screech came again. This time, it was clearly human. Pained, angered, and emanating from the main warehouse. The door slammed. That entirely broke my frozen, fearful state. I ran. I got into my car and drove until I was in cell range to call my father. He didn't believe anything about the doors closing, but agreed that the building had something weird about it. He told me he'd be right out. Fast forward half an hour. My dad and I met up and drove back to the warehouse. I showed him the door that slammed, showing him that it was separated from both the front office and the main warehouse, so no draft could have closed it. I told him about the thuds, the screeching, and the sudden quiet that overcame the building. He decided that we should check the main warehouse. Emboldened by his presence, I led the way. Something you should know about this warehouse: it was formerly a furniture manufacturing place owned by a Mennonite farmer. They made handmade chairs, tables, etc. Because of all the cutting that went on, the floor is thickly coated with dust. We walked into the warehouse and saw nothing out of the ordinary. The dust was untouched, the doors were closed, windows were locked. The only thing out of the ordinary was one of the hanging fluorescent light fixtures. It was hanging askew and swaying slightly. Insisting we take a look at the mount to ensure it didn't just break loose, my dad grabbed a step ladder. He supported it while I climbed up and grabbed the swinging light. I looked on top of the light and saw a handprint. A single, fresh, inhumanly large handprint. No footprints in the dust around the light, no signs of a presence. I climbed down and switched places with my father. He saw it and said, "What the hell? There's been no one in here for years." He climbed down and told me he'd been suspicious of someone breaking in and stealing parts from the warehouse light system. He couldn't believe me that this wasn't human, that something wasn't right here. The last thing he said was, "Nothing is here. Next time, just go back to work," and then, as if to show its presence, the thud returned. This time it wasn't just a thud, but more of an earthquake. The entire building felt like it moved. The heartbeat-like thud was then overlaid by the screech. The awful, awful screech. It felt it like was coming from the walls themselves. We ran. We ran and I haven't returned. My father hired someone to finish my job and has since moved into the office. He's heard the thudding, but thus far nothing has happened further. What actually happened? I don't know. Nor do I ever care to know. What I do know is that there is something paranormal in that building, and the men who sold it to us knew. I'll never forget the sound of that lock turning by itself or the feeling of the deafening silence. A weird light in the sky. This didn't scare us as much as fascinate us, although, let's be serious, I was freaked out. But when I used to live in Southern California, San Diego area, my dad and I were driving home from getting Baskin-Robbins for dessert. I'd say around 9:30ish at night, maybe later. Anyways, on our drive home we had to go over this hill that had a church to the right when driving west. This is a frequented area. The highway is to our left as we drive, so this wasn't a dark, deserted area. Rather, it was a populated, constantly traveled street. As my dad and I approached the hill, I noticed a long light in the sky, kind of like an airplane, but bigger, and moving quickly. Living where we did, We had heard jets/airplanes/helicopters fairly often, so we knew their sounds. This was making no sound. I stayed quiet until we reached near the top of the hill. I then pointed it out to my dad, and he slowed down. Luckily, we were behind everyone else since we had sped through a yellow light. We both stared in wonder as this long, non-flashing light moved further and further southwest towards Mexico and the ocean. Aliens are one of my biggest fears, and my dad knew I had an issue with them. But he quickly told me to take a picture with my phone. So I busted out my Verizon chocolate and snapped 2 or 3 pictures as we went down the other side of the hill towards the supermarket. And eventually our house. I posted on Facebook that night about it, and some friends commented about seeing it as well. We had no idea what it was, but it was large, moved very quickly, and was silent. I still have the phone, even though this was 2 or so years ago, and we've moved away from San Diego. It's currently in the drawer, in my childhood bedside shelf, next to me. If I can find a charger, I'll turn it on, but that phone scares the fuck out of me. The reason why is an entirely different story. Bodies in the road. I was driving a shortcut from 29 Palms, California to Albuquerque, New Mexico. 29 Palms is located in the desolate high desert east of LA. The shortcut was completely a 2-lane road through total nothingness, except for passing through Amboy, California. Amboy is a nearly abandoned town nearly as far below sea level as Death Valley, with a dormant volcano and lava field on one side and a salt flat on the other. It was also, at the time, a hotspot for satanic group activity, so I was driving by myself in the afternoon. I stopped in Amboy and snapped a picture of the city sign, just to prove I was there to friends who dared me to take that route to I-40. I got back in my car and proceeded to drive up into the mountain range between Amboy and I-40. Once I reach the top, I am driving north through a canyon with high grass on both sides of the road. Up ahead I see some stuff in the middle of the road. As I approach, I slow down to see a red Pontiac Fiero stopped sideways across both lanes, a suitcase open with clothes scattered everywhere and 2 bodies laying face down in the road, a man and a woman. I stop 100 feet or so away and the hair on the back of my neck is standing up. Being a Marine, I reach under the seat and pull out a 9mm pistol and chamber a round. Something seemed very wrong. It looked too perfect, as if it were staged. An ambush. Was I being paranoid? Something was just wrong. Getting out of the car seemed unthinkable. It was the horror movie move. As I scanned the road, I saw a line I could drive past the guy in the road on his left, swerve to the right side of the woman, behind the Fiero, and I'd be on the other side. I dropped it into first gear, punched it and drove the line I planned. I passed the back of the Fiero without hitting it or either of the bodies in the road. I continued forward a couple hundred feet and slowed down so I could breathe and let my heart slow down. As I looked up into the rearview mirror, I saw that the 2 bodies had gotten up to their knees and 20 or so people emerged from the tall grass on either side of the road by the car and bodies. At that moment my right foot smashed the gas pedal to the floor and did not let up until I had to slow down for the I-40 east on-ramp. I will never know what would have happened to me had I gotten out of the car to check on the bodies or stopped my car closer to them. Somehow I do not think it would have been good. Sometimes real life can be scarier than a movie.